Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Hey, welcome back, everybody. We've talked before about PTSD and how many of us do suffer from it. Different forms. Of course, it comes from a trauma, all different types of traumas. We're going to go a little bit deeper today in learning that there are different levels of PTSD and a spectrum included with that. This is out of my wheelhouse. That's why I call upon her. She is amazing. As a psychologist, she is a PhD. She is Ann Creekmore, and she's back with us. Welcome back, Ann. How are you?
Good, Steve. How are you?
Well, I've learned so much, as all of us have, with you being here. By the way, I do want to tell everybody that what we're talking about is also from your book, which is fantastic. Love Yourself, Love Your Life. It's like a workbook.
Right.
That's got insight into all of us. And the thing that we're talking about today is, would it be complex PTSD? Would we call it that?
Correct. Yes.
Okay. And when you talk about that, you're really meaning that there's a spectrum for a lot of diagnoses or diagnoses, right?
Mm-hmm. Diagnoses, correct. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yeah. Then let's look at PTSD, the different levels, the different types there could be.
Sure. Well, there's PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that's when you're older and, teen adult, then you have a traumatic experience. And then you get what's called PTSD, kind of an anxiety reaction where you may have nightmares, vigilance, like, feeling worried in crowds, something's going to happen, different kinds of other issues that you're kind of overwrought, scanning your environment, places. Maybe you can't even go out to certain places because you get triggered, you get flashbacks of what happened, whatever the traumatic experience was. You can also have what's called a child, usually like say under the age of 8, if they have chronic traumas or neglects that are traumatic, then they may develop what's called complex PTSD. It's not just a straightforward remembering a certain specific incident as an adult and then getting triggered by that incident, having anxiety. It's more of it's a kind of more of a spectrum kind of thing. I view it, and this is as kind of the spectrum of a dissociative identity disorder. You may have heard of, and I think it relates to borderline It's kind of like the underlying of borderline personality disorder. That's thought of as the chronic personality disorder, one of them, but actually underneath it, there's these components of usually the trauma from early childhood. And that what has happened is that the child has learned to dissociate or self-hypnotize, if you will, where they are chronically experiencing these traumas in their home, like say their parents have domestic violence, or maybe they're experiencing abuse as a child, or sexual abuse, physical abuse, and so on. And instead of having a nervous breakdown, they basically, because they're young, they can use their imaginations. They kind of self-hypnotize and kind of mentally go away, where then this trauma is going on. They just can't take it anymore. They kind of learn how to use their mind and mentally go away, where then and then when the incident's over, then they can put amnesia walls around it and they don't think about it, then don't feel like they're going to have a nervous breakdown. So a adaptive coping mechanism. But basically, once they kind of learn how to use that primitive or early defense mechanism, emotional defense mechanism of dissociation, this kind of becomes a coping method in general, so that they start everything that's a new stressor, they start to dissociate. It's like, oh, well, now I'm going to school and this is kind of stressful. I've got this teacher and there's circle time and there's people, friends, and so on. And so, well, okay, well, I kind of mentally, escape and self-hypnotize, and I'll go away. Another part of my brain will hold, become the student part. And so it kind of becomes a person who's kind of fragmented in parts. And of course, we can't see these things happening to the child, or they don't know what's happening, so they don't know it. And the face stays looking the same to some degree, even though you can tell things.
Can we talk about that?
Mm-hmm.
Can we talk about that? I
Sure.
find that fascinating. Call it self-hypnosis, attempt at self-healing.
Right.
Does it apply to adults as well? What we're talking about here? Okay.
Yes.
And is it reasonable when somebody says, yeah, that happened to me. They acknowledge it. That happened to me. I just block it out. I don't think about it. I just keep moving forward. Is that what we're talking about? And if it is that somewhat dangerous or hurtful to the person to just, sweep it under the rug, if you will?
Well, there are different kinds of defense mechanisms, emotional defense mechanisms. And some people who are maybe more linear in their thinking versus right brain or, visual kind of stuff, creative, may use a defense mechanism called repression. Repression is kind of, or suppression, that can be a conscious repression, but it's kind of like you could be just blocking it out, and you don't even remember the details of it much unless something really jogged your memory. And that's a coping mechanism. And maybe intellectualize, is another, coping mechanism, to just think about things and analyze things, but not feel. You can have emotional isolation of affect, it's called, where you might kind of remember what happened, but you kind of put underground, made it kind of unconscious, your emotions about it. So that's different than dissociation. That would be a person who'd be more compulsive and just kind of block or make subconscious these incidents. But the dissociation is a different mechanism, and children, be the ones to do it because they can use their imaginations well. Like, I go away and another part of my brain has, now I don't remember, it's amnesia. Now I'll do this, creatively. But that sticks with them. I mean, they do continue through adulthood to their psyche operates that way. So they've kind of gotten themselves in different modes or parts, or if it's an extreme form, like dissociative identity disorder, then it would be like alters that actually, could even have blackouts between their parts. So it does carry on. Mm-hmm.
So let's go even deeper into those 4 levels. And we're talking about PTSD right now, but you had said there's 4. Can we identify those?
Okay. When you're saying 4, I'm sorry, I missed something about that.
I thought I had seen that in your book, where there's usually 4 ways, 4 different types in that spectrum, especially for PTSD.
Well, I mean, there are different levels of, there's, like I said, there's PTSD that can be to an isolated incident when you're more of an adult that you are reacting to, like, you're in a, tragic bus accident or whatever. And then you can't, you're not sleeping at night, you're afraid to go traveling, and you're getting triggered when you hear something that sounds like a bus and so on. But we're talking about the more complex PTSD from childhood trauma and ongoing, more chronic kinds of traumas. And there are different levels, like everything. We're beginning to really understand that most disorders, or if you will, mental disorders, are on a spectrum. Like, we know that, that an alcoholic is not just a late phase of alcoholism where the person can't function, can't work, has to drink all day, or they'll get DTs and they'll, be hallucinating and withdrawal and tremors. That's not just alcoholism. It can go all the way lower, the functional alcoholics or early phase, there's phases to things. Likewise, we know, like, about autism. There's now they've put the Asperger's, the high, 0.5%, 1% that are functional, and they're in college, they're a little socially awkward, but they have neurodivergency. That's still on that spectrum, but it could also be all the way down where there's a child that is nonverbal, and can't, has to have, caretaking, so on. So there's different levels. So when you're talking about levels with complex PTSD, you'd be talking about different levels of that, where, like I mentioned, the 1 in 100 that might have it would be, might actually have alters and blackouts between parts and not even know. I mean, and I've had clients like this. I mean, some of them, I always give a dissociative experiences scale as part of my initial intake. I'm not sure that everyone does this by any means, but if they give these symptoms, then it's probably they're having this dissociative identity disorder spectrum, but it doesn't mean that they're going to have these alters, completely blackouts between. That would just be the 1 in 100 that has to, goes out and then has to go to their trunk and open it up and look in and go, where was I today? Oh, I was in Walmart. I've got packages in there. I mean, there are people that have that, and they really do black out completely between parts, but the majority of people have a good deal of co-consciousness, and that's kind of the levels where they kind of knew they did something and they might own that it happened, but they don't remember it, kind of almost like it would be ADD, like they weren't focusing. But it's not from neurodivergence, it's from an emotional defense mechanism where they went into another mode of themselves, another part of themselves, and that part was up front doing the activity, and the other parts of the self are kind of watching in the background and not really taking in everything or feeling actively like they participated in it. And
so
that can
I want to jump in here. Based on what you're saying, we do have a instant feedback. You can always reach us, instant feedback, steve@gmail.com. We have Rachel checking in from Teaneck, New Jersey. She says, I'm getting divorced and my son is having struggles with depression, anxiety, and more. It began when the divorce was announced. Would that be considered PTSD?
Well, how old is your son?
Doesn't say here. So let's go in a bunch of different areas, like smaller child and a teen, compare the two.
Right. Well, certainly that is a trauma for children, and at different ages, they reacted in different ways. Like someone 11 might take responsibility for it, feel guilt, it's just an example. But and it would also, it really depends upon the child, and what their reaction is to that. It's not necessarily PTSD. If there's been, domestic violence or something, and that would certainly give a child some PTSD. It would be how it was managed. It would be somewhat traumatic. It'd certainly be something that would be good to bring your child to therapy and just see how they're doing, figure out if it is having that impact on them.
Yeah, I think a lot of us overlook or don't understand that PTSD comes in many shapes and many forms. We might just say, oh, somebody's depressed, anxiety. Would you say that many times it is PTSD? They're having something connected to a trauma, something after a trauma.
Yes. I think there's a lot of triggers that people do in their, everyday lives, have triggers for sure.
How do you treat them?
Well, it would depend on what, level they were having the problem. Say it was in a severe form, like of DID, 1 in 100. That is a specific type of treatment where the person has to start understanding they have these parts and start to be able to let walls down so they can kind of contact their own thoughts and brains and not have them in isolated parts, and then work with the individual system, the internal family system. There's a specific form of therapy called internal family systems. You can look it up, or as the CAPS-I, CAP-F, CAP-S internal family system, where there's a certain treatment method for that severe or even medium. Like a lot of people will get diagnosed as bipolar or borderline personality disorder, and it's really an underlying dissociative disorder. And it's not saying that borderline personality disorder isn't there as well, but it's more of a description of what's going on versus getting to the root functioning of it. So it's so that form would be for the internal family systems form of treatment that really does help. So there's EMDR, eye movement desensitization reprocessing for the post-traumatic stress for an isolated incident. But for the complex PTSD, it's a much larger, more comprehensive treatment protocol. I mean, there are parts of the self that get frozen in time as well. And, maybe young even, that you can do hypnotic age progression with those parts to kind of get them up to the level. Because it's kind of hard to be a person that has a child in them that pops out at times and begins, I can think of an example like giggling in a meeting or something like a child. Right. There's a lot to it to helping the person with that kind of thing.
I've heard that for members of the military suffering from PTSD, that EFT, emotional freedom technique, also known as tapping, is very beneficial. What are your thoughts there?
Yes, that's a very good technique. And that's one that they can employ that kind of help them. And you can find it online even. It gets you and it's good to have free support type services that teaches you how to do the tapping and what to kind of say and to kind of bring you back to, a more whole.
Yeah, I think that many see this whole tapping thing because you're tapping different meridians, within your body, your face, essentially, right. Your neck. It looks ridiculous. Let's be honest. And you're speaking affirmations or speaking the truth. To somebody that doesn't know, they're like, "I'm not going to do that. Well, how's that even going to help me?" But these are proven techniques that really do work. EMDR, correct. Did I hear that right?
Correct. Eye movement sensitization reprocessing type of therapy that helps. I think it was originated on, major traumas like people caught in earthquakes, and it's a certain, technology, if you will, right. A certain approach where you can have the person talk about what happened and they get it reprocessed back into it's like what happens with the trauma is that the trauma doesn't kind of go into the memory banks that are everywhere. It just stays right up in the corpus callosum where it's vivid and almost as if it's just right raw there all the time and ready to be reenacted as if it's occurring in the present. And the EMDR is a type of therapy where the person is, talks about what that experience was, hones in, maybe their sensations are asked to be talked about and so on. And it used to be mostly that you would do a finger, the therapist would do a finger have the person watching their finger or tapping to hear, and that would help it so that while they vented in a sense, that would start to get reprocessed in the memory bank, so it isn't just up there vividly being re-experienced and triggered as a flashback.
Would you say that that's somewhat of a form of hypnosis?
Yes, I mean, I would say that, and although technically, if it wouldn't be called hypnosis as a treatment form, but I use hypnosis for flashbacks myself, and so to help, because I do a lot of hypnosis and renewing your mind to all the positives, and it's very good for the anxiety and depression in general, and so you can do it for flashbacks as well. That when it flash, when the person's relaxed, you can just tell them that if anything negative comes to mind, like that's a negative memory, it's just remembered as if it's in a past, like in a photo album from the past, and that you're still feeling this confidence or feeling free of fear. And that can help the mind renew and help reduce the flashbacks too.
The reason I brought that up with EMDR, because you were describing the eye movement, and when I call it self-hypnosis, I have audio I listen to where
Right,
I was hypnotized, but it's a technique where you just look up for, a couple of minutes, maybe a minute, whatever.
right,
And that gets you into a hypnotic state. I don't know if I shared with you, I listened to it every single night. The audio wasn't designed for sleep, but I found that it puts me to sleep. So
right.
every night it's 15 minutes long. I'm out before, 11-minute mark. I'm like, and I know what the practitioner is going to say, and then I'm out. But it's the eye movement. So that's when you said the EMDR technique, it involves eye movement. And that's what I was thinking, maybe it's kind of loosely connected to hypnotherapy.
Right, right. Yeah, that
Hmm.
makes sense. Hmm.
Okay. Um, from this point forward, when somebody is dealing with PTSD, there's all different techniques. How do you pick the right one? Is it really the level of the PTSD that they're suffering from?
Yes, I mean, it would be making a distinction between whether it is like PTSD versus complex PTSD and a childhood trauma, more complicated, more complex type of PTSD. Well, you know, I, what was brought up about the child, the parents going through the divorce, and is this a PTSD? Well, it could be. I can think of having treated a child, for example, and there was a divorce, and there was a new person becoming involved, and a new boyfriend to the mom, and there had been domestic violence in the the child's background, and he had kind of developed a part. He looks normal, goes to school, making good grades, doing sports and so on, but he just would have these meltdowns, and where he just gets so emotional, and it would be where a part of him that was like a protector part that had come to handle the domestic violence part of his brain, when he had to just kind of self-hypnotize to handle being in that traumatic, ongoing, chronic traumatic situation, that would come out when and get triggered by a new man in the situation. And so then that child
Hmm.
needed, even, or preteen needed to be treated for the complex type of PTSD, kind of uncovering when, the different parts that were holding things that he's not even able to be in control of. He's just getting triggered, and that part's having a protective, like, reaction, triggered reaction.
That brings up another point. In that situation, even if there wasn't domestic violence involved, introducing somebody in a divorce situation too soon. Um, what are your thoughts on that in terms of can that be PTSD? Certainly, I would imagine can be impactful. Yes.
Yes, I mean, and it's all about how, the parents handle and introduce. I mean, and often parents don't generally advise unless that there's a serious relationship and between the new person that's going to maybe be leading to marriage, or be a partnership, that it may be better not to be constantly bringing in new boyfriends, new girlfriends to the mixed, and then kind of making them disruptive. But if there's something that forces a serious relationship, they will want their child to meet and start working on some blended family situation. So it's not like, it's a problem in living. It's not necessarily a mental disorder,
Right.
provoking situation. But if that makes sense.
Yeah, and this just illustrates how life is such a fluid situation, and you could have two people, three people, five people experience the same thing, and they will internalize it totally different. Some might not be affected,
Exactly.
right?
Exactly. I mean, I would say generally you could say that most children who had traumas, as young children under the age of 8, are at risk. I mean, ongoing traumas or big traumas. I mean, house burns down, and everything
Sure.
is, and, or someone dies, things like this, or even medical problems, like they had medical problems and had to be frequently hospitalized, or family members, had some serious chronic illnesses or in and out of the hospital, parent or whatever. Anything kind of really chronic and major could lead to a complex PTSD that you might not even realize, because the person who has complex PTSD would, or the dissociative spectrum type, would have a life manager that will handle everyday stuff, or maybe a student part that can do the work. And so you might not really realize that they've actually gotten themselves in modes, or different parts that are popping out and switching. Most people might notice that they kind of switch and they're in a different mode, but they won't make anything of it. They might think, oh, well, that's bipolar, or that's just triggered, but it's actually the way their personality now has gotten compartmentalized and has to be treated that way as well.
You bring up so many great points that we don't even think of. And I think we all agree that many of these traumas happen to somebody when they're younger and they carry it with them for the rest of their lives. But it could even be something, a passing of a relative, or a relative who is sick, then passes. And it happens to, in a child's life. It could even be a grandfather. And you might not even realize that that had an impact on them. Then other things happen. And then it's more things piled on top.
Exactly.
How do you get to and I want to make sure we don't run out of time.
Mm-hmm.
But I'm curious, literally a minute. How do you get to the root of the problem? Whether it's, an adult or a teenager, I would imagine you have to find out what happened so that you can treat it. But is it through hypnosis? How is that discovery made?
Well, I mean, I would generally do a very thorough clinical evaluation, assessment the first time, the first visit. Um, and that would include questionnaires for ADHD, that would include a dissociative experiences scale that would have items on it that would, and you would score these things so that you would know whether, it reached a level. Then you would talk to them during the interview to find out more, what they were endorsing, items they were endorsing, to see whether it really fit with, say, for example, a complex PTSD. Like if a person says they don't have memory for some important things, like a graduation, or a wedding, I mean, or like, all of third, fourth grade, they don't, it's like, well, that would be an indicative. Or different kinds of experiences would indicate dissociation.
Wow.
So,
Is
so
that I don't mean to cut you off, but I'm
yeah,
really curious. When you're talking with somebody and they tell you, I don't really have a lot of memory of my childhood between this point and this point.
right.
Is that I don't want to call it a red flag, maybe a yellow light going off for you that, let me
Hmm.
look a little bit deeper there. Why is that piece missing? Maybe there's a reason. And then you dig a little bit deeper to see if there's
Right.
something there.
Exactly. I
Wow.
mean, you should do an interview and really get the person's whole childhood history, their, psychiatric history, legal history, their extended family, their psychiatric issues, to see if there could be genetic components to certain
Sure.
things. But then really ask and go through the DSM on areas like DID or ADHD, and really just run through it and make sure you have them, or on bipolar versus unipolar, and find out, are you meeting these criteria? Do they feel, because it's like, they're the ones that will tell you what symptoms they're having and what their experiences are. You have to just ask a lot of questions.
Sure.
Are they sleeping is a basic one, that, how many hours are you getting of sleep at night? And what are the problems with your sleep? I mean, it's just a big kind of investigation the first time, to really assess, really understand the person, and then begin with their problems in living that brought them in, and see, because you got to know the deeper root functioning in order to really help them with whatever their
Sure.
problems are.
Well, I guess that's why they call it intake. And I'm not a fan of
Exactly.
that. I'm not a fan of that word because it sounds
Yeah.
very clinical, but there's a reason for it, because you
Right.
need to get to all the facts. Uh,
Exactly. Perfect.
let's get to the facts about you. Of course, we have the book. If you want to read about your life, it's in here. AP Filosa is her pen name, her maiden name. You can find it there. Also, I'm sure at Amazon, anywhere you search for it, Love Yourself, Love Your Life. But if we want to find you, Ann, maybe somebody wants to help somebody else or even themselves, even through a session or learn more, what's your website?
Yes, I have a couple of websites. One's more in the process, but it's going to be related to maybe to the book specifically, loveyourlifehealingcenter.com. And but my main practice one for my licensed clinical psychology practice in Virginia is Psychologists in Virginia, plural, Psychologists in Virginia spelled out, and pretty much has all my information on there.
Yeah, always fantastic talking with you. You are deep, and that's great. But you make it easy to understand because a lot of this stuff we're dealing with, or people we know are dealing with it.
Yes, a lot more people have it. I mean, when I give the test, it's like close to 30% of people could fall on that spectrum, maybe not high up to be, like you're thinking, but they're having that same kind of experience and they need the same kind of help.
Yeah.
So,
thank you. Thank you so much for being here. Really, really appreciate it.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be right back.
Are you looking for even more of the podcasts and hosts that you love? The Podcast Business News Network is proud to announce that you now have even more ways to listen live. Check out the MyTuner Radio, online radio box, and Simple Radio apps on iOS and Android, or find us online. Search for Business News Network on mytuner-radio.com, or search Podcast Business News Network on streama.com and onlineradiobox.com/US. Take your podcast on the go and don't miss a minute of the action.
Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
For nearly 2,000 severely injured veterans, everyday life has become filled with barriers.
Day-to-day simple tasks can become pretty daunting.
I have to carry my chair up 2 flights of steps or have somebody do it for me.
What scares me the most is just the falling.
When I'm struggling with my house, I think, to have that one great barrier just knocked down, it's crucial.
Home for Our Troops is a wonderful nonprofit that builds a
mortgage-free, fully adaptive, handicap-accessible house. And there's no catch.
It'll be our very first home that we've ever owned.
This is a game changer.
This is where your life begins again.
We need you to join us in completing this important mission. Please visit hfotusa.org and help build homes and rebuild lives.
Because of you, everything's going to be okay.